What if, during clinical death, you came face to face with Jesus? A shocking story of a woman who died on the operating table, spoke with him, and returned with proof that the afterlife is real. A documented medical case that doctors cannot explain, and you will not believe what he told her. There exists a documented medical case of a woman named Karen Thomas. On the 7th of July, 1982, she was lying on the operating table in a hospital in the city of Anchorage, Alaska, under full general anesthesia. According to all medical indicators, she was in a state of deep unconsciousness, and it was precisely at that moment, according to her own words, that she ceased to perceive herself as being in the operating room. Karen said that she suddenly became aware of herself not inside a body, but in motion, and not within familiar space, but as if within the flow of existence itself. She was being rapidly lifted upward at an unimaginable speed through the ceiling of the operating room, through the floors of the hospital, and further above the city. The world below was shrinking, losing its outlines, and gradually disappearing. Ahead of her appeared a dark opening, resembling a gigantic cave. She was drawn into it without the slightest resistance. The darkness, as she described it, was complete and absolute, yet it evoked neither fear nor anxiety. The speed of movement continued to increase, and in the very center of this darkness, a tiny point of light appeared. The light was rapidly approaching, expanding, and gradually transforming into a distinct passage. When Karen passed through it, the surrounding reality changed completely and irreversibly. She found herself in a place that did not resemble any earthly space and did not look like any world familiar to her. Everything was different. The colors were different. The very sense of space was different, and even the experience of her own existence was different. The strongest sensation was a feeling of absolute peace and all-encompassing, inexplicable love. Looking around, she saw a bright yet strangely empty space. This did not at all correspond to how she had previously imagined heaven. When she looked downward, she saw neither legs nor any physical body. She clearly felt her presence, her form of existence, but understood that it was no longer a material body. At that moment, she heard a distinct voice telling her to follow it further. Karen slowly turned around and saw a man dressed in simple white garments. His dark hair was neatly combed back. On his feet were sandals, with leather straps running up along his calves. His appearance was modest, yet, according to her feelings, filled with dignity and inner seriousness. She immediately understood that this was not Jesus Christ. At the same time, she had not the slightest doubt that this being was not beside her by chance. He began to move forward unhurriedly, and in that same instant, the space around them completely transformed. Before her eyes opened a vast green landscape filled with life. Endless fields, countless flowers, and trees with dense, lush foliage. Everything around seemed to glow from within. It was not reflected light. Every object emitted its own radiance. The colors were so extraordinarily vivid and so entirely unfamiliar that, according to her words, some of them simply do not exist on Earth. She wanted to stop and carefully examine this place, but the voice sounded again, clearly and insistently, urging her to continue onward. She no longer moved in the usual sense of taking steps. A single desire to be near him was enough. And in the next moment she was already behind him. There were no distances there in the earthly sense. Thought and action occurred at exactly the same moment. They moved through this all-permeating radiance, and Karen felt more and more clearly that she was approaching something extremely important and momentous. Before them appeared a river, shining just as brightly as everything around it. The water did not reflect the light. It was light itself. Karen looked toward the opposite bank of this extraordinary river, and it was there that she saw people whom she immediately recognized as her relatives. She recognized her father, who had died when she was 7 years old. She recognized her brother, who had been killed in a car accident. She saw uncles and aunts who had long since left their earthly lives. All of them were standing on the other bank and looking directly at her. All of them were radiating their own light. All of them were smiling. All of them were filled with joy and deep peace. Her heart was filled with such a powerful feeling of happiness that she took a step toward the river, wishing to cross to the other bank and be with them. And it was at that very moment that the guide firmly stopped her. He clearly told her that first they needed to go to another place. She looked once more at her loved ones. They were looking at her with love and calm, as if they perfectly understood what was happening. However, she did not know whether they were aware that she was going to return back to life. The guide began to move along the river, and she followed him without hesitation. They walked beside the glowing water until the space suddenly and completely opened up before them. Before their eyes stretched a vast, wide expanse without clear boundaries. At the very center of this expanse stood massive doors. They were enormous, majestic, and inexplicably significant. The doors slowly and silently opened. The guide entered inside, and Karen immediately followed him. At that moment, she still did not know that beyond those doors, an event awaited her that would change not only her understanding of life, but also her understanding of who she truly was. Behind the doors was something entirely different from what she had expected. The space inside was much smaller than it appeared from the outside. At the center stood an oval table resembling a conference table, yet at the same time completely different in every possible way. The material from which this table was made did not resemble wood or metal in any form familiar to her. From its surface emanated a soft, living glow filled with gentle light. Around the table sat other beings, whose presence was clearly felt throughout the entire space. When Karen entered, all of them looked at her at the same moment, without the slightest trace of doubt or hesitation. At that very instant, according to her words, she felt something strange and extraordinarily powerful. All of them knew exactly who she was. There were no questions and no uncertainty in their gazes. There was recognition and complete understanding. It felt as though they had been waiting for her for a very long time. It also seemed that her arrival was part of a long-established and unchanging design. She could not rationally explain this feeling. She did not remember any of these beings from her earthly life or from any time known to her, and yet the sense of familiarity was absolutely undeniable. It was similar to that rare feeling that arises when one meets someone truly important, when no words are needed. The guide remained close to her the entire time, not stepping away even for a moment. Throughout the whole space, there was a strong, almost tangible sense of anticipation, as if everyone present knew that something extraordinary and decisive was about to happen. And then, according to her words, she clearly realized one thing. All of them had gathered there specifically because of her. The guide looked at her attentively and said that now a review of her entire life would begin. Before she had time to ask even a single question, everything began instantly. Before her eyes unfolded her entire life, from the moment of her birth to the moment when she was 32 years old. But it was not like watching a film, nor like ordinary memories. She did not simply see what was happening, she lived it again every single moment. Every scene, every conversation, and every smallest detail unfolded simultaneously, with full and overwhelming intensity. At the same time, another astonishing experience arose, no less powerful in its impact. Karen began to feel what other people felt in every situation in which she had ever been present with them. She experienced their pain, their joy, their fears, and their love simultaneously with her own emotions, especially in those moments when she showed patience and compassion toward others. She clearly sensed how her words and actions changed the inner state of other people and influenced their subsequent reactions. When she was harsh or unfair, she had to experience the pain that she herself had caused. Nothing was hidden in this experience. There were no justifications and no protective barriers. She saw how even the smallest actions set entire chains of consequences in motion. She observed how one good deed gave rise to another. She saw how a smile, a word of support, or a simple gesture of help passed from one person to another, expanding into invisible waves of influence. At the same time, a deep understanding came to her of how closely all human choices are interconnected. She realized how enormous the significance of every, even the smallest detail in life truly is. According to her words, this was not a judgment and not an accusation. It was comprehension, learning, and the unfolding of the truth about who she had been and who she could become. This extraordinary review grew deeper with every passing second. Scenes overlapped with one another, forming a complex and intense picture of her entire life. She felt the presence of the beings around the table, their attention, their patience, and their calm. And then the guide spoke again, uttering words of great importance. He clearly stated that she could make a choice to remain in that place or to return to her earthly life. At that moment, her heart was torn by conflicting feelings. That place seemed perfect in every possible way. Absolute peace, pure love, and beauty beyond words reigned there. However, the guide continued speaking without breaking the moment. He said that if she decided to return, they wanted to show her one more important thing. Before her eyes, according to her words, it was as if a window opened into another world. She saw a hospital waiting area in her earthly world. Her husband was there. Her 9-year-old daughter was there, and her 6-year-old son was sitting there as well. They were waiting, not knowing what was happening in the operating room. She saw the surgeon who came out to her husband, still dressed in surgical attire. She saw the fear on her children's faces in that dramatic moment. Then the guide showed her the people whom she had previously asked to pray for her. Their prayers, according to her words, looked like light and like energies joining together into a single whole. Among all those prayers, she also saw the prayer of her own daughter. The girl at that moment was convinced that her mother had already died. She prayed for her mother to live and not disappear forever. When all those prayers merged together, Karen felt that something deep within her was beginning to change. Emotions returned that she had believed she had left far behind. Maternal love returned, along with the desire to protect her children and a profound sense of responsibility for their lives. It was precisely then that she made her decision about her future path. She clearly told the guide that she wanted to return to her earthly life. He looked at her with deep compassion and replied in a calm voice that she would receive proof that all of this had truly happened. After a brief pause, he added another important warning. He said that she would not be able to remember everything that had been shown to her. However, he also said that she would remember enough to never doubt the reality and authenticity of the experience. After that, according to her words, the entire path suddenly broke off and disappeared. She did not remember the return. She did not remember the tunnel. She did not remember the backward movement itself. The next thing she became aware of was opening her eyes in the post-operative recovery room. Her children were standing nearby, and her husband was silently holding her hand. And it was precisely from that moment that the part of the story began, which to this day raises the greatest number of questions and doubts. When Karen Thomas regained consciousness, she was already in the recovery room after surgery. Her children were beside her the entire time, and her husband was tightly holding her hand without saying a single word. According to her own words, the first sentence she heard at that moment was spoken in a whisper and sounded like this: she had returned to life. The operation was completed strictly according to the medical plan. She spent 12 days in the hospital, undergoing a full course of treatment and physical recovery. From a medical point of view, the healing process proceeded in full accordance with established protocols. But at the same time, as she claimed, something entirely different was happening to her, something for which there was no medical explanation. She constantly felt the same deep peace and the same unconditional love that she had experienced in the place where, according to her words, she had gone during the operation. She emphasized strongly that this experience was not similar to a dream, nor to the effects of any medications. She stated with confidence that it was not a hallucination and not a product of imagination. The sense of reality of what she had experienced did not fade with time. On the contrary, it became increasingly stable and deeply rooted in her consciousness. And it is precisely here that one of the most mysterious details of this entire story appears. Karen claimed that after returning, she learned about the decision the surgeons had made during the operation itself. The doctors, who before the procedure had hesitated between a laminectomy and spinal fusion, ultimately performed exactly a laminectomy, the very procedure she had fervently asked for in her prayers. For her, this became the first physical confirmation that what she had experienced was neither an accident nor a simple coincidence. But the confirmations did not end there. She said that she could not forget the promise of the guide, who had told her that she would receive proof. In the first days after the operation, she did not attempt to analyze what had happened. She simply observed her inner state with full attentiveness. The feeling of peace did not disappear even for a moment. Love did not weaken for a single second. It was as if that other space had never completely left her. Over time, she began to recall individual fragments of the experience, but not in an orderly way, rather as sudden flashes of awareness. Some images returned unexpectedly, others appeared during sleep, and still others came to her in moments of complete silence and concentration. At the same time, a growing sense took hold within her that a significant part of what she had seen remained behind an invisible veil. She understood that she had seen far more than she could retain in her earthly memory. She could not rid herself of the thought that she had been shown something that could not be brought back into this world in its entirety. As time passed, this feeling only intensified. People to whom she told her story asked her the same familiar questions, and she always answered in the same way, that this experience was more real than any dream, that it had not disappeared, and that it had not dissolved with the passage of time. She never tried to convince others of her version of events, and never set herself the goal of proving anything. She merely shared what, according to her conviction, had truly happened to her. Years passed. Life went on in its usual course. The children grew up. She returned to her professional activity. Yet what she had experienced remained close, like the shadow of another reality, constantly present somewhere very near her everyday existence. At times, she caught herself once again remembering the faces of the beings gathered around the radiant table. She recalled their gazes and that strange, profound sense of recognition, as if those bonds had never been broken. At other moments, the river of light and the relatives standing on the opposite shore surfaced in her memory. Then she would wonder whether they had seen her return, and whether they knew that she had chosen to return to her earthly life. The words of the guide also did not leave her. The words that she would not be able to retain everything she had been shown. With time, she increasingly reflected on what exactly had been hidden from her, what knowledge about the future had been revealed to her, and for what reason she had not been allowed to keep it fully. She said that from that moment on, she began to perceive life, death, choice, and responsibility differently. Yet until the end of her days, she was never able to clearly articulate what exactly had changed within her the most. She knew only one thing: her inner world was never the same as before. Many years passed before she dared to speak about all of this openly. And even then, she honestly admitted that part of what she experienced on that day remained forever beyond words, beyond the limits of memory, and beyond the boundary from which a human being cannot bring experience back into this world. She asserted that death no longer seemed to her to be the end of existence. However, she did not attempt to explain what exactly, in her perception, it now is. And it is precisely here that the central question of this entire story arises. If during the operation she truly existed in a state of consciousness outside the body, saw other spaces, beings, and events, and also received knowledge that she is unable to fully recall, then what exactly was hidden from her, and for what reason?